Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the season finale of Masters of Health. I'm your host, Deidre Sully, and I am here with my final guest for the season, Dr. Norissa Williams. Welcome, Dr. Norissa. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, and thanks so much for having me.
Good. And everybody just heard the phone ring, but that's okay. These things happen even live show. As you know, like this show is to give people a glimpse inside of the lives of people who are in the public health sphere or health sphere. And so if you're in the arena of getting your master's in public health, or you did, or you're just plain interested, this is the place to be. So I'm going to just start, because this show is all about the guest. It's not about me. So I'm going to ask you, Dr. Norissa, so can you give us an overview of what it is that you do? What is your profession?
Okay, so currently I'm working. I've had long, windy road to where I am now, but currently I'm working. I have my own business. It's called Liberation RPI, RPI standing for Research and Practice Institute. And so what I do is partner with organizations to help them move further along in the continuum of being more equitable with respect to race, although I do consider it through an intersectional lens. So I have a variety of clients, some, in the mental health sector, some in hospitality, higher education, various organizations. I work with them and, make their workspaces more equitable.
Okay. So is there like an element of kind of researching the organization, like seeing where they are and like where it is that they're trying to go so that you can help them get there? And then like, what does that look like when you're done? Then do they bring someone in to help execute it, or you stay there until execution?
So I stay there. Good question, right? So it used to be before 2020, the summer of 2020, people just wanted to check things off their list, and they would bring me in for like a quick training and like the most basic of trainings, which is like an understanding implicit bias. But thankfully now people have advanced, and it is no longer just for a training, even though that may be an entry point, right? What they hire me to do is to come in and do a needs assessment. So I'll begin to interview, and sometimes I'll do surveys, but I really like to have a one-on-one with people.
Yeah.
So I like to meet the people in the organizations, particularly those with marginalized identities, so people of color, sexually expansive people, just to understand what their experience is in the work setting, and to consider what are the kinds of things that need to be addressed and changed, and really tapping into what the pain points are and hearing like, what needs to be addressed. After that, I analyze the data, looking at what are the organization's strengths, because organizations have strengths too, even if they bring me in, because most time they'll bring you in when something has happened, right? Yeah. So looking at their strengths, because I consider their strengths as a starting point for where we can go. I can utilize those strengths to take us further, right? And so then I also present to them, what are the challenges? What are the opportunities for growth? And that might look different for each organization. Some organizations, it may have been that there were earlier issues related to race that were never addressed adequately. And so there's a lot of harm, and there's a lot of silencing in the organization around race and different things like that. So I'll then also give them a plan. We develop a strategic action plan, and it's very collaborative. And with that, I identify like 4 to 5 goals, maybe actually more like 5 to 7 goals for the organization. And then for each of those goals, there are objectives and action steps, and then people who are accountable for those goals. So for the most part, some of those things I'm responsible for implementing. Some of those things we also want, the idea is so that the organization is not always dependent on me. Whereas it has happened also that people are like, oh, well, I like these services so much, stay on with us for 5 or 10 hours a month. And I stay on with them, and that's great, right? But it also happens that I work with them to increase their own capacity. So there's more of an infrastructure within the organization after I leave, so that they can continue to execute these kinds of the changes, because some of those changes might be policy changes, practice changes, start, just really, it really varies depending on what the problem is. And so I then might stay along for technical support as well. So like, these are the things that we said that you were going to do. And, you might have a hiccup, and I'll meet with provide continued consultation about how to better implement that or address whatever challenges they may be having.
Mm-hmm. What do you I think you said something incomplete, or like it was done wrong, like, so like if like harm, you are addressing harm that was done because maybe something was done improperly, like maybe a policy implemented or they didn't do it right. And that's, I'm paraphrasing because I'm like, that's how it was like processing in my head. Can you correct me, like what was correct me, like what you actually said, and then like can you explain that a little further?
Sure. And it was, what you said was pretty much along the lines. And so I'll give you an example. And I'll give you an example. So let's say in the aftermath of, because this one is like pretty common with the organizations that I have worked with, even though there have been other more specific things. But to give you something that's not identifiable to a specific organization, let's say after the murder of George Floyd last year, and organization said nothing, right? The organization, what happened is that maybe people of color ended up having to, particularly Black people, ended up having to do a lot of the education of, and it's excessive labor that's very taxing and emotionally burdening. I mean, I'm saying this, but I know that those of you who are in those positions know exactly what I'm talking about and what it was to be in those positions. And so it ended there. Let's say the organization said they were going to do this or that or the other, and nothing happened, right? And so there was like a moral injury within the employees that are people of color, and or their accomplices who were like, I thought we were going to do something different, but you're proving to be the same as everyone else, right? And so people lose faith in the organization. There's a little morale, those kinds of things. So that's one example. There have been, I'll give you another example.
Like empty promises.
There was an example of a client group that I had. There was there was a white supremacist within the organization who had said something, and it really bothered like a lot of the people of color there. So one of the women spoke up and was like, what are we going to do about this? I don't feel safe here, because it was said that this white supremacist said that they were going to harm all the people of color, right? So then they had a town hall where people spoke about their issues, but nothing happened. Nothing happened, but there was no measure to protect the people of color in the room. So the things that were said about people of color were further harming, and everybody just moved on their business. And they thought, well, I had a town hall. Wasn't that good? Wasn't that good enough? And so, and this particular instance was like 5 years ago. And what they didn't realize is that those that were harmed never moved on from there and never felt safe again within the organization. So that might be, in terms of like intervention, that might be a restorative justice approach, as well as teaching them more skills like compassionate listening or conflict mediation, should those things happen again, because it happened. There were several instances that happened again, and they were handled in the same way, or not handled.
I have a question. So I think so things are so different now, right? So before COVID, I think it seemed to be like harder to just pick up and go, right? Their minds weren't there. Whereas now, like from the Great Resignation, people are like, because we were all forced to figure it out. Some of us are still like working on that same model, like, employer, somebody pays me, I go to work, I do a job, and I go home. But then others have really tapped into that entrepreneurial spirit. And, there's no more, and we talked about this for those of you watching, you can check out the True Health Lab podcast. We talk all about this on the season finale over there, The Great Resignation. But back to what we're talking about here. You can no longer like hold that carrot over people's heads in that same way. So, coming from that social work and counseling and psychology point of view, do you have any insight onto, why people stay? Like, aside from maybe it was like, well, this is my job and I don't have any, but, you said it was like 5 years ago. And I would think like within 5 years, that could be enough time for people to like, all right, I'm going to find something else. Like you're not going to be able to just like tomorrow, I got something new. Some people maybe, but you know, it takes time for some people, for many people. So what is behind, like you ever dive into what's behind why did you stay other
Mhm.
than like, you know, well, this is what pays my bills? Because like a time period of 5 years is probably enough to say sayonara, like, you know, this is not the place I want to be working for.
So I think a lot of factors go into that. So with this particular organization, it was a higher education setting. And so the people who were harmed were students. And so they knew that their time there was time limited. I just have X amount of years and then I'm out. I'm never looking back. So that had a lot to do with it. But I also think in general, there are specific people. I haven't heard it referred to as the Great Resignation, but I mean, I'm one of them. I left a high status position and was like, no more, no more, and started working for myself. I mean, if I've been consulting for a while, but I've been now doing this full time since June. Um, and so I think it has a lot to do with what people think is possible for them, right? So
Yeah.
whether or not people think that how, whether or not they have a developed niche, right? So for me, it worked out. And for a lot of the other people that I worked out, that they had a developed niche or a specific idea that they could further develop to and monetize, right? I also think now, as compared to 5 or 10 years ago, if we're talking work setting and not the students that I was referencing before, there is so much bigger, like with social media and the ways in which people can like make money and monetize things. That's an avenue that we didn't have even for sure 10 years ago, and probably just a little bit less so 5 years ago. And
Yeah.
so I think that has a lot to do with it. But I also think the women who are leaving, the people who are leaving are Black women,
Mm.
particularly, and being entrepreneurial. I saw in the news yesterday that 2% of businesses prior to, I don't get me to lying, but this was before COVID. Before COVID, 2% of businesses were owned by Black Americans. After, COVID, during COVID, it's increased to 13%. That's a huge jump in such a short period of time. And so I think a lot of us had moral injury, right? So we've been in these workplaces and been like really, really, really hurt, right? And I can say that that was my experience. With people who, say that they're for the cause and all those kinds of things. And then you realize like, you know what I mean? I'm out. You know what I mean? I can't, my eyes are too open now and to knowing like, and my eyes have been open because I've been doing this work for a while on the side, but my eyes are too open now and I've laid myself too bare. There's no coming back now that I see that you're not really with it. You're with the BS. You know what I mean? So I think that kind of frustration, depending on what your instance was, but I mean, I think it's really also what people believe is possible for them.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's like, well, it's almost like that sobering assessment, right? And then understanding like, well, this is how this person or these persons, you know, want to run their organization. So maybe they have every right to. So I'm gonna go do my own and run it how I think it should be run, you know?
Yep.
And I think that is the spirit that we have to take on. Maybe it's not just like I'm gonna go in here and I want to change how you do things. It's I'm gonna start my own, and
Yeah.
because I know what I need, and I know what people that look like me need, or at least I want to try to give them that. And you're not the right person to be dictating that. So I think if we
Exactly.
kind of move with that in mind and have that real sobering assessment, like, all right, no more town halls, deuces, you know.
Exactly. I'll add to that. For me, it was also oh wow, what did you just say? It made me think something, but then I lost it that quick.
um you know, if this is the way a certain person or
Oh,
persons organization.
so what I was going to say is that it's funny because in 2019, I had a student reach out to me that was not yet in the program. So before this, I was the director of a master's program, two large master's program in a university setting and a counseling psych program. And so I had a student reach out to me because he realized that he was asking around like, well, what other Black male students are there? What other Black male queer students are there? And sadly, he in an incoming cohort of 100, he was the only Black male student, far less, like far less Black male queer student. And I said to him, I said, there have been times when I've questioned my placement here, me being here. And what I've learned is that, you got to be in the system to change the system. So a year later, I revised. I told him, I said, listen, I changed my mind. You have to have been in the system, know how the system operates in order to change it. And I'm going to affect change outside of the system, right? And it might not be that exact system, but it will be others like it. So, and that's exactly what I'm doing, really. Like, so I'm partnering so that people don't have experiences and have the frustration and be triggered, because racial trauma is real, and be triggered the ways in which I was triggered in my work setting by, quote unquote, well-meaning people, progressive white folks, you know what I mean? And so it feels good and it's restorative to be working with institutions where I know my work is making a difference for marginalized folk. Even the needs assessment, the interviews, the one-on-one interviews, and sometimes I have group interviews, when people are getting to express themselves and they feel heard, that's also the part of the healing. In the beginning, the catalyst for change, where people do feel like more liberated in the spaces. And so it makes a difference. You know what I mean? And I do feel like I'm affecting change or changing systems from the outside.
Yeah. So I just want to kind of bring it, make the connection here, because we talk about a whole bunch of stuff on this show. And I have it feeling like some people are like, well, how is that related? I think, to draw the connection, it's really related because this really deals with the mental health, right, of employees in an organization. And so regardless, and that can be a public health organization or anything, a school, a higher institution of higher learning. And all of this matters, as those of us who were students at one point, your mental health matters, and so that's kind of how I think it brings it all around in full circle, because these are the diversity, equity, and inclusion sector is something that has to be able to touch on everything. So this is why it's really important to have that part or that piece. You can't leave out that piece of public health, because it's really become a large part of the conversation. I mean, it's always been there. It just, changed names, for cultural competency, and it's been changing names a few times, but it just goes to show you that it's always been there. And so now I think it's like you said, people are really trying, I'm gonna say, to make that effort to affect change in a real way. And I say trying because it's been some time and we're still trying. I will not say try anymore once we see something has shifted. And I honestly think the shift will have to be all right, like I said, no more town halls. We're gonna create our own. And that's just a reality that that's that sober assessment many of us are gonna have to acknowledge.
Yes, I want to add to that, if you don't mind, about why it's a
ahead.
public health issue. Black and Latinx people sleep less, right? So on average, they sleep 2 hours less than other racial groups because of discrimination experiences, right? That seems like a small thing. Okay, well, they sleep 6 hours and not 8 hours, but it has, large health impacts, right? So you're not coming to I'm not waking up at the same starting place as someone who slept 8 hours if I'm only sleeping 6. 2, my body is not getting to restore itself, produce melatonin at night, get me, on my proper circadian rhythm. I'm also secreting more stress hormones. So it's lending me to more incidents of disease and different things like that. But there's also lots of research about the cognitive load of what happens for people. All people of color having to code switch and frame switch, that is, it's when you're in these institutions, and that it's a lot. It's a cognitive task that white people don't have to endure in the workplace. So it really does impact our psychological health as well as our physical health as well.
Yeah, I have tried my best. I'm not sure if I've accomplished, but I'm done with the code switching. Like what you see is what you get. Because I do have like a bit, or it could be like I've learned how to like merge it all, into one kind of thing, but I'm just like, yeah, I don't have the space for that anymore. I just don't. I
I
don't.
love it. I love it. That's liberation. Yeah.
Have the space. And does it mean like that I have to quell things? Like, yeah, of course, because you want to make sure that you're not walking around scowling at people like if you're having a bad day. Of course, like those things happen. But when it comes to like, I think like the code switching is really like an altering of the personality depending on what audience you're in front of. And like, yeah, you do have to be mindful of the room so your language will switch. I think that is anyone, if you're in a room full of astrophysicists, you're gonna, speak a certain way regardless of what color you are. And if you're in a room where it's like maybe just, it's a party, you're not gonna be in there like in a stuffy suit talking about like inertia. And so I'm not a physics person. I'm just picking words that I remember from high school. Like, well, you understand what I'm saying? So like, of course there's gonna be that. But when it comes to like the fundamental of like your personality, I'm done. Like, I'm just like, I can't do it. I can't do it. It's just, it takes up too much space in my brain. So, and we want that space free, because like, right, I already don't get enough sleep. So, yeah. You know what? I wanted to ask you, like, when it comes to institutions of higher learning, because I remember being in that space where it's like, oh, it's a day of tolerance and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I remember thinking, like, tolerance, that's like temporary. Do you realize what those words mean? But, so then it makes me think, like, it's to your point. The students are, if it's students, right? I'm here to get what I need and I'm going to go. It doesn't really hold the institution accountable to actually make a change because people are always filtering through. So nothing really changes. So how do you actually get to a point where you see actual change if it's a particular institution like that where there's always a cycling through and turnover of people who will be affected? Like, how do you even do that? Because they'll be thinking, well, these 4 years they'll be gone, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So, well, policies and practices, right? So the students, the courageous students who I'm thinking of right now, who lent themselves to, gave themselves and really fought for the change, to have a consultant, for them to pay a consultant. They may not feel, because a lot of them are near graduation, different things, that they're doctoral students, and it's 4 or 5 year degrees, 6 year degrees. They're near completion, so they may not see the benefits. But the work that I'm doing is really to change the infrastructure, right? So that there are policies and practices. Now I'm trying to think concrete. Okay, so I'll think about another organization that I work with and that I love dearly. They're not higher education, but it's a student led organization as well. And so something that we're working on with respect to changing and really institutionalizing equity is developing this pipeline, right? So not only, because what happens is, oh, we have to have, diversity, blah, 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 right? But then there's nothing that happens within the institution for the diversity, right? So in the needs assessment, it was identified that there needs to be more opportunities for advancement within the organization for the students that come in, because what was happening is that they'll come in for like 2 years, master a skill, drop off, right? Whereas to further their mission, it would benefit the organization for them to come in 2 years, develop a skill set related to the mission of the agency, and take that as like missionaries, right? Take that into whatever workforce, because they're doing work that impacts Black and Brown communities with respect to drug policy. Take that within their professions, whether they go off to be lawyers or teachers or social workers or counselors. Take that and still advocate within the spaces that they're in. So we're it's going to be a 3 to 5 year plan, but talking about developing mentorship programs, partnerships with the community to bring in more people of color at younger ages. And then, holding specific spots for people of color, making sure that they're partnering with organizations of color, like having a yearly checklist, and also yearly assessments. What are we really doing to, like, we said that we're going to have more people of color. Let's look at it and see, okay, we did have 50% more people of color speakers at our events and those kinds of things. But having like specific benchmarks and measures that you assess yourself against, against, but also really thinking about belonging and really thinking, questioning and working through how do we create, systems where there is belonging within the organization. And that might be like even affinity groups and,
Yeah.
different things like that.
Yeah. And what about like, as they do like business, like, I know most times, especially in the realm of like health, public health, it's like partners, but we still like things have to get done. We still do things and we have to partner, we have to purchase and work with vendors. What about like, um, even like working with like MWBEs or sorry, because we do this a lot in health. MWB is minority or women-owned business enterprises. So if you ever see MBE, that's minority enterprise, or WBE is women business enterprise, and those are businesses that are owned and operated by people of color or women. So that was for the audience, not for you. I'm sure you know what that is.
That was what?
I said that was for the audience, not for you.
Okay.
I'm sure you know what that is because we have a tendency to speak in acronyms in public health. And
Oh
so what
God,
happens,
social work
like,
too, psychology too.
and like people are like, what does that mean? So whenever we use acronyms, it's like, let's explain what it is. So, what about, those kind of movements, like making sure it's because if we're talking about like social and behavioral work, right? It's like you said, like it's like the affecting the processes. So the process has to change for it to become like rote, and ingrained in the memory. And then as people cycle through, it becomes like, it becomes part of the memory. Oh, this is what we do. So
Exactly. So changing the culture there. And so with respect to that, um, that might be making, I mean, this hasn't happened in the work that I've done yet, but it's not outside of the scope of something that I would do with an organization, making sure that at least 25% of your vendors are either women owned or people of color owned and different things like that. Cause I think it's important to make that stance too. Cause
yeah,
a lot of the companies that I'm working with right now they really want to be um, leaders in their field with respect to race equity, right? And they're in such varied fields. And so if you're going to be a leader, you need to demonstrate what this looks like with respect to real structural things, right? So we need to walk the walk. Not walk the walk. Yeah, walk the walk. We need to walk the walk instead of just talking the talk.
yeah,
And making sure, and then being public about that too. Like this is something
yeah.
that we do, showing as a model. This is something you can do too, and
Hmm.
making clear statements about like it might even be, and this it might even be. There's one organization that I've worked with where there was a lot of harm in the past, particularly to women and women of color. There was harm, period, but particularly to those, to that population. And there was like a public
Hmm.
acknowledgement of this is what we're doing, right? And so holding, I mean, who knows if people really read the post or the announcement, but this is what we're doing to right the wrongs, and we've acknowledged these wrongs, right? Because even just admitting that and admitting it publicly is healing, because I focus on healing too. I'm very trauma informed as a psychologist and social worker. I am very trauma informed in what I do. I also seek to be very holistic in what I do. So I bring mindfulness in and all of these kinds of things and indigenous practices. And when I say indigenous, I'm thinking, indigenous because restorative justice isn't indigenous approach of the Americas, but also my own cultural approaches. My family is from Trinidad, so thinking through Caribbean and the continent and different things like that. So I seek to be very holistic in my approach too.
Yeah. Speaking of which, you talked a little bit about your background. So how did you you're consulting now, you're part of the Great Resignation. It's I don't know, it has different names. The one that I've heard used most is Great Resignation. Some people call it the Big Quit. Recently I heard someone I read or the Great Reshuffle. I don't really like that one. I'm partial to the Great Resignation.
I like that. I like that.
How did you get there? So tell us a little bit about your background in psychology and sociology.
So how did I get there? Let me see. Okay, so because it's such a long, windy journey. So my master's is in,
That's like stories about how you got where you got, because
say
that
that again.
helps people.
Oh, you like
I
the
said
story?
that's okay. Like the story. We
Okay,
like
good,
stories
good, good.
here.
So I mean, and it's very relative to my own background. And I tell this story a lot in the work that I do. So my family is from Trinidad. And when they came here, they came to East Flatbush, which was a very Trinidadian enclave, right? So there was no dissonance between what there was congruence, I should say, between what happened inside my home and what happened outside my home. So my preschool teacher was Trinidadian, so much so that when I spoke English, it was with I was born here, but it was with an accent, in my earlier years. Then by the time I was in kindergarten, we moved to, well, I still came home to Brooklyn on the weekends, but my sister and I went to Long Island during the weeks because my grandmother lived there and we were going to go to a quote unquote better school system there. And so I was in an African American neighborhood, and racially we are the same. And I very much identify as both African American, like Trinidadian American, or the overall like Caribbean American identity as well. But I noticed what was happening outside was so different from what was happening in my house. And so early I began to question, like, what is this difference? Like, why are we so different? And I realized early that it was a matter of culture, right? And so then when I started going to school and I was in these honors classes, and because of racism, structural racism, I was one of very few people who were Black people and people of color in general who were in the honors classes. So now I'm thinking about race as a context and how different my experience was from these white people in the classroom, and why I did not feel like I belonged. I felt completely invisible, so on and so forth. Went to college, studied abroad, went to Ghana, and further, like, having this fueled love for cultural differences, why are
Mhm.
people different kind of thing. Came back, I got my master's in social work, and I chose social work because I had not a therapist, a professor. She was speaking about her own work, and her own work was therapy work. And so she had clients, and I was like, oh, I like that. I want to do that. And so I said, what degree do you need to have to do that? And my major at the time was human services. She said, get a master's in social work because it's a terminal degree, and then get your doctorate. And so I had no other, I mean, I still don't even have many family members in this country, right? And so there weren't people who had gone through the school system here before me. So that's the advice I got. That's the advice I took. And so immediately after I graduated, went straight for a master's in social work, which really was me. It was the greatest path for me, and why I like social work. I mean, I went to Stony Brook, and it was a school of, they used to call themselves, I think they do, like the School of Social Welfare and something something, but it's very relative to public health because it's approaching it from a very, it was like public policy, talking about social issues. Even if we operated on a micro level, it was
Yeah.
still very much considering things on a macro level, right?
Mhm.
And so after that, I began to work in the field, and in the community. And what I was doing was working with families in their home, providing intensive case management for the youth had a diagnosis, and there were behaviors in the home, and the family was at risk of being separated and put into like foster care or different things like that. My job was to come in and keep the family together, and that might be through teaching them skills, helping them navigate the community. And I had this amazing, even though I didn't want that job at first. I was like, I want to be a therapist. I want to work in a community mental health setting. But I was fortunate enough to get this job despite what I thought it was. And I interfaced with various systems, right? So the child welfare system, the family court, the school system, so on and so forth. And again, with this background that I have, this personal experience that I have of noticing difference and noticing how people are treated, I kept thinking, like, these laws are racially biased, right? Specifically the family court. These laws are racially biased, they're ethnically biased, right? My mother was a teenage mother, right? If you force, and I ended up living with my grandmother, but with my family circumstances, if child welfare had ever gotten involved, and my mother had to do individual therapy or family therapy in order to get me back, and you only have like 12 to 15 months to get your child back when they're, in foster care or whatever, she would have lost me. You know what I mean? Because she wasn't going to this day, she would not go to anybody's individual therapy or family therapy. So I really began to think about that, and I wanted to be a part of the solution. So whereas I initially was going to get a degree in clinical psychology, now that I had a master's in social work and I could work clinically, I no longer needed that, and I wanted to think more community level. And so I was really psyched about NYU had a program in community psychology, but it closed that same year. And so they had a program also in psychology and social intervention, but it was a brand new program. They only accepted 1 or 2 students. My backup school was Fordham, and it was applied developmental psychology. And so all of these are health psychology degrees. So again, it's still related to public health as well. And so that's really the study of prevention and intervention across the lifespan. And I just
Yeah.
honed while I was there, I honed my interest in really studying like what is it, because I was really interested in culture and laws that were not biased, and organizations that were not culturally and racially biased, and that could actually meet the needs of people of color. And so really I crafted, like, most of my research has been in that area. And after that I still didn't know exactly what I was going to do next, but I was at teaching at Medgar Evers College for a bit, and then I was teaching at New York University, NYU, for a bit as well. My last position within academia having been the director of the master's program, like I said, in a counseling psych program before I left. I mean, I still adjunct at NYU, and but I don't necessarily see myself. I don't want to work for anybody else like ever again. I love this too much.
Oh, that's so awesome. Can you explain to everyone what you mean by terminal degree?
Okay. So meaning, and I'll give a comparison. So a master's in psychology is not a terminal degree. You're not considered a professional. You're considered still a paraprofessional with a master's in psychology. In order to practice clinically, if you had you have to have a doctorate in psychology, like clinical psych or counseling psych. And that's considered terminal. You don't need anything more. It's considered like the highest you can go. Now, in
Mm-hmm.
social work, you can get a doctorate in social work, but a master's in social work is considered terminal. And you're considered a professional, and you can get even. I mean, it's recognized by insurance companies in terms of like being able to be registered
Right.
by insurance companies. Yeah, so you
Mm-hmm.
don't have to go, any higher. You are considered a professional.
Right. Because there's hours that you have to complete that lead to that. Right. Right.
Yes.
I just wanted everybody to be able to like hear that. So it's like, well, is public health a terminal degree? Probably not, but that's
I want
okay.
to say it is. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but I want to say that MPH is a terminal degree.
It depends on what you want to do. Like, because we've had like guests on and we talk about like, you can do so many things with the degree. So it's not something where we get hours and things like that because it's so vast what you can do. So it's not a terminal degree,
Oh,
but
okay.
there's the opportunities are open. Like, because I didn't have to do, so many hours of this. Like, of course, with any grad or master's program, there's, practicum or your the project, that I have the word just like went out of my head.
Thesis?
Your thesis, thank you. We all have to do that. It's not as extensive as as a doctorate, but that's just like that's the norm of most master's programs. But it's not terminal as in like the social work degree. So some people, which I believe I've had on here, will have like MPH and also MSW and whatnot. So like, yeah, but thank you. Give thanks for that. I wanted people to understand that because we have talked about dual degrees and like, people who are interested in law, you can do MPH in law or you can be an MPH MBA. Like there's so many things that you can pair it with. So
Yeah.
that is really cool. Being that you love what you do, tell us about a day in the life of. So
A
what is
day
your
in the
day?
life. It's so diverse. Well, one, I work from home, so that's amazing. Um, and when I start my work day, it can be any range of things, right? So I have a client list right now of maybe somewhere between like 7 to 10. And the only reason why I say somewhere is because sometimes the work that I'm doing with them varies. Sometimes it might be like create this, create an e-learn, and then you're done. Let me think of a concrete day. Um, so there are okay, I'm thinking of last week. So last week, one day I had to meet with a client. and really say like, okay, so based on the issues here, we had way more interviews to do. So we had, so I need, we need to contract and talk about more hours. And so what that would look like, the need for that, and that person was going to take it back to the organization to really talk about, let's get more compensation for her. I also begin to clean some of the data. So when I interview the people, I write down things or whatever. Sometimes it's very like da, 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 so I could catch everything, and then I have to go back to them and just like make sense of what it is that I wrote down. So I'll clean the interview like that. It might also be meeting with. I met with another organization on this particular day for new work. They wrote a grant before for a summer program for racial, ethnic, minoritized people. They want my consultation to really think through the development of the program because they were denied 2-3 times, and they want to think through the lens of the work that I do. So we had a planning meeting about that in the work, and so. And then I also am writing an article with another group of people about deep structure curriculum changes so that our curriculum really is anti-racist. And so I did some writing for that. And then, forget the other personal stuff, my 2-year-old daughter, my 16-year-old son, and, those kinds of things.
Yes, like I got all of that. So a lot of the work, the research work that you do, it's more on the qualitative side.
I value qualitative. I mean, well, first, there's such a bias because the whole system is rooted in white supremacy, right? There is such a bias within psychology because they fought so hard to establish themselves as a science that they want to model after hard sciences, like physics or what have you. And so they devalue, I should say, still qualitative research. And it's when I was in school, I remember wanting to do like a qualitative study, and they said, establish yourself as a real scientist first and then do that. And I'm like, I think that's real science.
That's kind of really difficult because psychology is so it's mixing like the objective with the subjective. Like you have to like get to a certain point to figure out what a person's thinking, like why they're thinking. All of that's qualitative information. You can't just like bang it out in numbers. Like you can get like if you're asking, like, and we all know this, like, just general questions. How do you feel about this? Rate this from 1 to 10. Da 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 da. That's all good and fine. But then there needs to be like some secondary, like maybe pull out a few people, do some in-depth interviews, which there are firms that do that. Like I'm working with a firm now on something that I do with tobacco to get that done. Like you need to have like an understanding, this is why I answered this question this way, because it's not enough to just check off the box and think that why people are doing that. You have to, in order to know the why, you got to dig a little deeper.
Exactly.
So like the qualitative is necessary.
Exactly. And you know what, I'll add to that, it's very culturally grounded, right? So we're storytellers, African descended storytellers, right? And so I learn through stories, I teach through stories. Last night in class, I teach a trauma class. And so last night in class, we were, because of the first 2/3 of the semester, we're really talking about trauma, how it impacts the brain, how it impacts behavior, and then we talk about intervention. And so I asked the question of, what have you gotten so far as we're transitioning to talking about intervention? More than like, I would say at least 1/3 of the class were like the stories, right? So my case examples and different things, that's what people lock on to, like, and that's like no matter what culture you are. But
stories resonate.
Exactly. And I learned through stories, and I'm honoring my culture in doing so and valuing the story, this human approach, this one-on-one connection kind of thing. So
yeah, because it's, we could answer something the same way, like we both say yes, but our reasonings behind why we say yes could be very, very different. And then that's why it's like, this is why like we're still here in a sense, right? Because there's a lot of, we probably have the same idea in a sense about broadly, right? Broadly, this we like, okay, yeah, we agree with that. But like the reasons why we get to that point are so vastly different because the values are different. Our culture is different. So like that's why we're still having a problem, because there is a fundamental disconnect to, how we got from where we are to point Z or whatever, it's like it's there's a disconnect. Our pathways are not the same. So like there's no way to make uniform policy and things like that, because the pathways are so different. I mean,
Mhm.
we can do it, because that's what happens. We do it, and then everybody has to follow it. But we'll always end up at protesting and picketing signs because we're not really understanding why we're doing it.
Yeah, and I'm not even, yeah, and I'm not devaluing quantitative, but I'm just saying
Oh,
make some space for qualitative too. That's
yeah,
all. And I hear that's what you're saying too, because like that's the
yeah,
real, you get to the support of what is being found quantitatively through really
yeah,
engaging in
yeah,
this way.
yeah. And I think like that's like the issue with public. This is, and someone has said it before, and this is the truth. Public health is not always necessarily worry about like the individual stories. Like, yes, we promote them because like that's what helps with health promotion. But at the end of the day, it's all about like, well, how do we help the masses? There's going to be some drop off, but how do we help the masses? And I think like, that's why, again, we get back to a point where it's like, well, what happened? What do we do wrong? And it's because of that idea of like the masses without like that necessarily like really digging in deep. And the truth is, maybe it just can't be done. There's so many different cultures, especially like in this one place. Maybe it's just something that we'll always have to be working at. That's just the reality of it. We might have to always work at it. It's not going to be like a quick, easy fix.
Yeah, but I think that is 100% true. But I also think that if there was more interdisciplinary collaborations, you know what I mean? And we operate in silos for the most part.
We do.
You know what I mean?
We say
Which is
that very siloed.
exactly.
Like,
And
I work
so
on diabetes and I'm going to do this. I work on tobacco. I'm going to do this. My focus is heart disease. I'm going to do this.
exactly. So I think if there was more collaboration, because yeah, so even within a discipline, you know what I mean, there is such, silos like you're pointing out. But if there was just more collaboration, we could save ourselves a lot in finding like these answers to very intricate and personal issues and different things. Because I'm benefiting. I say that what brought that to mind is I'm benefiting from hearing you and really thinking, even through your lens, through public health lens.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what is a pro about what you do, and also something that you wish you could change?
A pro. A pro is that I get this amazing opportunity to marry what my personal values with my professional values. So it is my personal value to fight for justice, right? And a lot of us think like how, like what it seems so abstract, right? But if we think about like what's my small piece, then we can all accomplish and do something if everybody does their small piece. And I feel like I'm doing my small piece, so it gives me personal satisfaction, that I'm being a part of the solution, and I'm also helping people heal from racial trauma, right?
Yeah.
Um, and something I would change. I mean, I always wish I had more time. Like I'm very much. I mean, I'm a very much a nerd. Oh, I want to read this. I want to read that. I want to read this. I want to read that to perfect my practice and to do this and to
Yeah.
do more and different things like that. I mean, I guess like that's the biggest con. Or sometimes like people who don't want change. There. I mean, I've worked with organizations where people are like, oh, I'm not talking to her. I'm not talking to her because they benefit from the racist system and they want it to stay the way that it is. You know what I mean? So, I mean, it would be having more, but I also don't worry about them. So I say that as something I would want to change, but I also don't worry about them because if we have a critical mass, there will be enough momentum to experience a cultural shift, and they'll eventually drop off because the environment will no longer be comfortable
Yeah.
with them. You know.
And that's what needs to happen with public health. We get critical mass. Like, that is the thought part. Like, critical mass, everyone else will figure it out. That's kind of what it is. Um, so the final question is, what advice would you give to someone who wants to get into that? Like, because like I said, they can be in public health, but maybe, the clinical psychology is also where their mind is at. So what advice would you give to someone in that space, or who wants to be?
I mean, I would say that, well, people have to sit down really and think about what it is like internally, right? So don't make the decision in your head, make the decision in your heart. What is the kind of change that you'd like to see, and how would you like to be a part of the solution? Because I actually think of degrees like social work as a beautiful marriage between like a clinical psychology and public health, because it's, you know what I mean? It considers, in social work, they consider like, you know, micro level, meso level, macro level. That you're trained to think in these ways, similar to how you
Yeah.
would do with public health, and then you
Mhm.
can practice clinically while still also keeping your foot, because there are social workers who work in policy as well, and you know, different things like that. So I would say, you know, really think about the context. Do I want to help one on one, or do I want to help on the group level? And then kind of like make your decision based on that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Wise words. Give thanks. So that rounds out Masters of Health, our first season. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, and sharing your journey and what you do. And willfully, anyone who's watching, this will help you. And there's also different episodes and different career paths with the videos that you can look at. And we really hope that you enjoyed this one. As always, if you have any questions, you can email me at djsully@gmail.com, or you can hit me up in the comments below or the message boxes, any one of our social media platforms. And also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell on the bottom. Give thanks, Dr. Williams. Give thanks for everyone for watching, and we will see you in 2022.
Thank
Peace.
you. Bye bye.